Welcome to the 69th episode of the interview series, a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based nonprofit organization that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. Please like and subscribe to help us continue producing excellent content. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Zach Savich, whose books include the poetry collections Momently, Black Ocean 2024, Daybed, Black Ocean 2018, and the memoir Diving Makes the Water Deep, Rescue Press 2016. Savich's work has received the Iowa Poetry Prize, the Colorado Prize for Poetry, the Cleveland State University Poetry Center's Open Award, and other honors. His poetry, essays, reviews, and collaborative work have appeared widely in journals and anthologies, including American Poetry Review, Boston Review, Best New Poets, Georgia Review, and the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day. He teaches at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Welcome, Zach.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me.
So in Momently's opening poems, we're treated to such images as a cardboard harmonica, sawdust bridges, a debt of tissue stems, and light in a Pepsi can. One portmanteau that comes to me the more time I spend with your work is this idea of verisurrealitude, or verisimilitude, nudge, extraordinary. In what ways does your collection evoke or invoke verisurrealitude?
It's such a good coinage, verisurrealitude. And also when you put those words together, you also hear their parts differently. You hear the green of ver, you hear the truth of ver. And I'm really glad you focused on those constructions, the sawdust bridges, cardboard harmonica. That's really one kind of figure that appears throughout the book. There are twine wires. There's maybe a fern armor. These things that have a useless utility. When we think of verisimilitude, we in writing we often are thinking about credibility, about aligning what we present with a sense of the world. But we know that the world is incredible, is overwhelming, that poetry's subject is often the ways in which reality doesn't align with itself. And so surrealism, I think, offers tactics to get toward that. And I know surrealism might come up a lot as a shared interest of ours. I think often of a line from Andre Breton. He writes, if it would only hail in jewelry stores, if it would only hail in jewelry stores. And I love that because we often think of surrealism in terms of the hail in the jewelry stores, the fantastical, unexpected image, which yet has an echo of diamonds and ice, the hail seeming like jewels. But I think the motivating moment is the if it would only, that sense of a desire or a need that requires that transformation. So that's what comes to mind as you mentioned that word, verisurrealitude, this sense that the world requires a transformation in order to be represented in its reality. Um, I think early on, it might be the first line of the book, we see the line goes, the suits we made to endure the unendurable fire could not, so we made them prettier and for longer. Uh, the unendurable fire will destroy the thing we're making, so we make it more decorative. We embellish it. I don't know if that speaks to your own sense of surrealism, but those are some concerns of the book.
It does, and I've often thought of surrealism as a safety net, particularly if you are working in more of a confessional mode. And I'm seeing my students, they want to address their traumas in ways that during my undergraduate years, even though I was a musician, but I could not imagine being as forthcoming with some of the difficulties I was facing. But younger people are more open now with that. And what's great about surrealism is you can speak of these traumas, but if you need to make them just stranger, if that gives you some sense of security, then you can embrace surrealism for that point. And isn't, you also talk about diamonds. my brain just goes to diamonding and diamonded and all the ways you can transform a word with the gerund, with the past tense. And that also leads to some pretty surrealistic combinations or surprises in language as well. You can have diamonds at a garden party, or they can be at the fire escape garden, or those could even be the shards of the ruined greenhouse cathedral. These are the parts of Momently that remind me, a former Cleveland resident. We're doing a lot of time travel today to the year 2000 and 2003. But as a former Cleveland resident, if you find yourself between East 115th and Hessler Street, there's this little micro thicket, and this is in the heart of University Circle. There are student apartment clusters galore, and also Cleveland's botanical gardens. But thinking of the natural elements and just wondering, how does Momently serve as an account of these surroundings of nature, which, if we're thinking in terms of ecological award and the reward of that, it leads us to the lines in your poem Sinew. Paradise cannot counteract, so it must contain the suffering. The suffering paradise cannot counteract.
Hmm. Oh, there's so much there. We could spend a lot of time just talking about that zone of Cleveland. It's right near Hart Crane's house. It's right near the East Cleveland Cemetery, which is a it's a small cemetery in the shadow of the monumental Lakeview Cemetery on the hillside. Uh,
Mayfield.
Yep, yep. And also you're right, we're also very near, or you were very near one of my favorite streets in the world, which is that little street off Hessler that has wooden bricks. And it's just such a fantastical image. It seems they're ash. They recently replaced it. The workers told me it's one of three or four such streets in the country, a poetically rich place. So as we're, I mean, you mentioned surrealism in the current moment, and I'm seeing students interested in not only surrealism, but in other artistic movements that we might associate with the early 20th century. And this has to do with reasons of politics, and I think with reasons of alienation, looking for methods that can speak to spectacle with spectacle, but they can also keep their camouflage in certain ways. They can be seditious while also being aslant. Um, if you're working in these methods, it helps, you're defying what you can think. The world defies what we can think. So we start to think with the world. We go for a walk, we see the wooden bricks.
Mhm.
When I think of this environment and when I think of this work's relationship to places, it's through a feeling that we don't have the words we need, so we need to look around. We can say the hardest thing we can, but then we need to say something else. We think with places, we think because of places. So I think that's often emerges for me from a large proposition, like the one you mentioned about what the nature of paradise, which is something that I might feel, but I couldn't prove. I'd have trouble following it through with propositional logic. How do you think about paradise and suffering logically? Like that's all of philosophy, that's all of theology. So you look around and think with images. Yeah, I'm curious, what other images stay with you in a resonant way from your time in this Cleveland neighborhood?
Well, my first year, 2000 to 2001, I had no car, so there was a lot of walking. So I pretty much every Saturday I would do a walk from East 115th Street. There's that overpass that takes you to Little Italy, so I would go up Mayfield, up that brick, and am I recalling, on the right side, there's a mural. There's a large Catholic church that I would try to get to some Sundays as you are just entering Little Italy. There's that
Uh-huh.
bakery. There's the La Traviata. Not to, I guess not my favorite Italian restaurant. I'll be very diplomatic. And there's also Valentino's Pizza. I think that's also got the kind of like the red brick road. And I believe there was, I think her name was Terry Carlin, who was a luthier. And I know all the students at Cleveland Institute of Music would go to Little Italy to get their bow rehaired.
Hmm.
And then just the walk up to, so Cleveland Heights, so Coventry, the Big Fun, which is in another question. I don't think it's there anymore. Caribou Coffee, and also just walking up to Severance Center in the day when there was actually a Border Books which must have closed when they filed for Chapter 11, I think in 2011. But that was a lot of my walking. And then sometimes I would go into, I think, the Cedar Lee area. First, there was a grocery store, and I would just kind of come back to my apartment with 2 or 3 bags of groceries if I wasn't getting a ride from someone. And Jackie Syed, who will also shows up in these questions, she was my probably the most benevolent chauffeur I've ever had. She would take me places. And I also just remember driving up Mayfields until it turned more, you would leave the Little Italy murals behind and you'd go past the cemetery. And then I think you keep going down and you get some hotels, you get some more construction-y kind of, I guess like a lot of road work was being done. There is a library I think I actually applied to a long time ago just for a part-time job. And I think if you go past that, there's a bookstore that had a comic book rack that you one of those spinny comic book racks. So my second year, I had a car, so I did a lot of driving, just because I was not really in a musician mindset, even though I was there to get a degree in music. But
Hmm.
my brain was just having other preoccupations and just other aspects of my life that were just not really ready to fully commit to music. And there was some mental illness, some obsessive compulsive disorder, some agoraphobia. So my it was a 1995 Buick, but that just became so that was like my little stagecoach. That just took me wherever I needed to go.
Hmm.
And just Arabica, I don't know if the coffee joint is still there. I remember that you could get some, oh gosh, it's the Greek spinach. It's like a Greek spinach sandwich. I'm blanking on the name of it, but they would like stick it in the microwave. It's the famous Greek sandwich with feta cheese in it.
Hmm.
But
I'm not
I remember
sure.
getting that at Arabica, and on the Lemongrass, it was a Thai restaurant in Cleveland, I think Heights. It was just I always have wanted to go back to Cleveland and I've been back in 2007. I was back in 2011 and actually went to Oberlin from 95 to 2000. So Cleveland was always in the backyards, and generally it was the place where you would go for your auditions for Tanglewood as a musician or for New York String Seminar. And it's just how I formed I guess you could say my 8 year relationship with that part of Northeast Ohio. And then Canton Symphony Orchestra was 2001 through 2003. So the carpool down. I remember getting a Krispy Kreme donut outside the Football Hall of Fame. And I think the grand claim to fame, I believe Macy Gray was from Canton, Ohio. And so it was, and you know, 2000 was a Macy Gray kind of year. So it stands to reason that 2001 we'd still have some Macy Gray like the hurrah hooray of Macy Gray to get all poetic with
Absolutely.
it. So that's just what I think about Ohio. And even, you know, Cleveland is a very interestingly situated gig town where you can earn a living if you're not in the Cleveland Orchestra. You could do Canton Symphony, Akron Symphony. You could go. I gigged once in Erie Symphony, and you could also do Wheeling in West Virginia. I did my share of wedding quartets throughout
Hmm.
that region. But also that was the era in my life when I was thinking, okay, I don't want to continue with music. What else is there? And I think that was the moment when let's apply to work at the library or let's apply to work at
Yes.
that food co-op. And what I remember about that co-op was, and I think as my obsessive compulsive disorder may have kicked into higher gear with fears of contamination, I remember just people at the co-op just putting broccoli on the rock and on the conveyor belt without a bag in it. And interestingly enough, 2000 is also the year when I noted more and more of the self-pay. And it's just that there's a Tops and a Giant Eagle around that neck of the woods, and they both started having self-pay. And it was just, well, what about the cashiers that need to make a living?
Hmm.
So that is
Oh,
what brings to mind.
what rich layers, what rich layers. And a lot of those things are there. And I love this feeling of the different transparencies of your experience. It actually reminds me of the effect of reading your poems sometimes, a sense of layered expressive experience. And you're also making me realize that, you know, sometimes there's an idea of Cleveland as a Rust Belt city as being hollowed out. People think of a downtown where there are blocks that lack the density of some other downtowns. But you're actually noting these densities around the peripheries. on that walk you described, you're moving through different spaces of architecture and culture, and people on different sorts of mission along the way.
Mission, yes. There are times when I was living in the Bedford area that I would drive out to Twinsburg just because I thought it was maybe a better grocery store for my OCD. So
Mm,
later in the night kind of runs out to the Twinsburg, and it's either the Giant Eagle or the Taos, because if you're in Cleveland, it's one of the two. So it's a 50-50 chance that I'm right or wrong, but it's one of those two that was out there. And then you get to thinking, okay, the Twinsburg, I was not around for the Twinsburg festival, but you've got those twins that come every 360. There's like they do that cyclical journey for the Twinsburg. And then gosh, I remember Beechwood, that area,
hmm
and that was also there's a sort of a more boutique kind of mall that had a good restaurant, had a good bookstore. I remember very much. This was also around the time when I started getting into more heavy metal. I know, ashamedly, I had a Blink 182 phase. We don't talk about that so much, but I guess I'll make an exception today. But I think it was right after, especially after 9/11 in 2001, when there was just so much. I remember having a tape deck and just putting in my Def Leppard that I had dubbed off of my CD and just driving all the way down, or actually up in this case, because of the hill, up Coventry and all the way to the outskirts of it before you would hit the more, get onto this overpass to get to here and there, more
mm.
of the sort of turn off sections of Coventry, but just going Friday nights for sometimes 30 minutes to an hour and then just turning around with my tape deck and the heavy metal. But 2001, discovering Judas Priest, discovering Crocus of all things, these bands that not many, well, people have heard of Judas Priest, but some of the rarer bands, and buying those kind of greatest hits compilation CDs at that
hmm
Beechwood. And I think there's also when you could get X-Files videotapes in the little three
Yes.
pack. Oh, total. I had like an X-Files shrine in my apartment. I think it took up most of that efficiency unit, a big Mulder and Scully shrine. So it's interesting because, when you think about the totality of everything, this dovetails us back to this idea of you have a poem titled Featured Totalities. And why I enjoyed that, it offers a speculative biology. The first naturally grown human wings were wooden wings in rain. Then we have a simile. Now, what do you make of that? Petals and glass and gravel and moss, like snow in a crocus flute. And then we have tactility hacks, as in house with one doorknob, move it room to room. That's probably the best doorknob moment in a poem, by the way. Someone should nominate, if there's a doorknob there's a football hall of fame, there should be a doorknob hall of fame. And this would be probably this would, yeah, goodbye, rock and roll hall of fame. We got to make room for the doorknob hall of fame. And if we go to the poem before feature totalities, which is vascular, you have a plant luminescence hack, and it states, put the basil where the light is most basal. In addition to the imperative, if you are shell, at least have ocean sound in you. Bad advice. If you are shell, have shell in you. What is your aesthetics relationship to pragmatism and logic?
Mm. Um, I love the idea of the doorknob Hall of Fame, and I would need to, I forget who it was, we steal things from the world. I heard about someone doing that who was finishing a house and he was moving the doorknob around. And I think it stuck with me because I wondered, why do you need privacy? Who else is in there? Why do you need to close each door room by room? I hope people will now contact us with other doorknobs from poems. Uh, I, None are coming to mind right away, but we'll see. I'm imagining there's some where you feel it for the heat or the cold. I love the sense of tactility hacks, speculative biologies, this pragmatism that's a little askew. I think of, do you know a Robert Bly poem called One Source of Bad Information?
Not as
Um,
well as I should.
it's a short one. It posits that in all of us, there's a 3-year-old child who hasn't learned anything for 30,000 years and keeps telling us things that have been key to survival. And I don't read a lot of Bly, not someone who's close, who I'm particularly close to as a poet, but this has stuck with me. And the idea is that a lot of these statements, these pieces of information, are wrong or false but some can save us. And I love the idea of the provisional wisdoms, the incomplete proverbs that we form along the way, the sense we get of the right way to do something, or the sense of the right way that might be the right way at times, the answer to a riddle that hasn't emerged yet. So I think that's key to this idea of pragmatism about things that might work, that could work. Put the basil where the light is most basal. It sounds like advice, it sounds like information, but it also kind of comes apart. And so I think I'm drawn to the lines that have the shape of aphorism or the shape of proverb, but do not have the finality of finished authority. So they have that shape, the container that feels solid, but you also feel them dissolve and open up again.
Well, and it's interesting too, because when you were just talking about the basal light, and I was thinking, there were student houses and apartments back in my Oberlin days where there definitely was some basal light. And I think the ones that were above most of the, because Oberlin, you got that sort of like that one little street that is the town, and then you have the conservatory right there, like about a foot away from it. But there were, if you go up the stairs in some of those apartments where I was at a Super Bowl party in 1998. I remember it because I did a recording for summer music festivals in the Super Bowl weekend, and then went to Rami Vamos was having a Super Bowl party because it was the Green Bay Packers. I forget who they played, but that definitely some of those apartments that you would the least expected to be found apartments. That's where you would locate the basal lighting, and I would imagine.
Mm.
I'm thinking you would probably find basal lighting conditions maybe on Kenilworth and Overlook in the Cleveland.
I think I remember, yeah, seeing someone there with a beautiful herb garden on a front porch, and so you think of, yeah, and where's there the rhubarb light, and this is where's there the
Solon,
whatever
it
it
would be
is,
in
the
Solon,
evergreen
Ohio.
light.
It'd be in
Yeah.
Solon because isn't that where Stouffer's is headquartered?
I believe you.
Okay.
I love that. I also just, I have your enunciation. You can tell that there's the first naturally grown human wings were wooden wings in rain. I also, I love that it's a tongue twister. So it has this sense of kind of daffy logic, but it also defies enunciation. But I know you come with some training here.
I've practiced. I've practiced. Well, flights, speaking of wings, it has a deeper significance in the poem Sparkles. Its third section tells us, my fortune was the tea bag broke. I drank the leaves. What poetry means to me is reading a poem. Looking up, pinning down, I found pinion is on the wing. It's not a central feather. It's central to flying. A butterfly probably rode on one time. I wanted that writing. I wanted that writing to leave me. I wanted that writing to leave me bereft, beset, freshest, and worn. Vowel listeners, this one in particular, we're going to love those contrasting E's. You have the leave, me, be, reft, be, set, fresh est. And I'm also reminded of a line by one of my favorite poets, Jonathan Minton, who I've interviewed him back in 2022 for this series, and he's always been a great supporter of my work. He's the founding editor of Word for Word,
Mm.
and he's got this line, whatever error allows flight. Minton's statement, standing in for my writing praxis more times than not. Were there any errors, however you define this word, that took momently into more realized atmospheres?
I love that quote. Whatever air allows flight. I was just learning something about insects have wings for skimming. They skim water with them, but they can't fly. But there might be an air where one then does lift. I love that sense of the accident that can become dependable, or can become something you can trust. That seems true to the practice of poetry or of other habits. Error is such a good thought here. I think I need to praise and celebrate Black Ocean, the publisher of this, which I've had the honor of working with them for a while and loving their books longer than that. They're coming up on 20 years publishing, and they have the beautiful feature of so many small presses, independent presses I love of they publish so many different types of books. They support so many people. and they're not doing one thing, but there is an editorial vision that emerges. And having them as a publisher, having Carrie Olivia Adams and Jonica Stuckey as readers gave me the courage to write in ways that had error in there, errors that felt honest. To write every every poem in this book looks the same. This
Mhm.
would not be a flashy standout in many blind reading periods. I was writing this for people who I knew would read it, and I knew they would receive it, and they would tell me if they thought it should be different. That gave me a courage to write in some ways that were leaned into error. So, for example, as this book found its final form, I started to cluster together some words and figures that are very similar. I had been taught, or I had taught myself, that it's better to spread out motifs, to say something than sprinkle its echo further along. Here, I clumped them together, which created some of the textures that you've noted. I also did things like defy the ways I typically ended poems. Rather than ending with the best line, a resonant, stabbing stinger, I would follow up those lines with something else to create a sense of unraveling or skid. So I think that that sense of error, of doing the wrong thing in a way that felt like it activated a different muscle, a muscle that might have a wing attached to it, a wooden wing maybe. Yeah, that absolutely key to feeling like this was an honest book. But it's indebted to those editors and the publisher.
Nice. And the muscular aspect, I mean, most of my writing is done by hand, and then it's
Mhm.
only when I need to get it into send it off to a critique group or start thinking about a submission packet, that's when it goes from the notebook phase into the screen phase. But there is something to be said, and I'm trying to encourage that in my students. I know my literary interpretation students, they actually do letters to the author. They handwrite them in class. They've got about
Mm,
10 they do a semester. They do their handwritten exams. And there's something to be said just about, and one of my mentors, Tracy Brimhall, actually gave me a writing prompt once where you just take your non-dominant hand and you write with it and see what happens when you tap into that side of the brain.
mm.
So I may recycle Tracy's knowledge and pass that on to my students this semester. So
I love that sense of transcription. I think of, is it Rob Halpern's book Commonplace? He's in Michigan, or was it, that's about, it involves a transcription as an act, and he's also recording what happens to his body during transcription in the
mm,
book. I'm often encouraging the visual art students I work with to think about when they're writing about their art toward an artist statement or whatever, to think about what their body's doing as they make the art, right? And how that is embedded in whatever the finished product is.
mm,
So your sense of, yeah, are you writing that from the shoulder or from the wrist? Are you spinning a little bit? The moments hunched at the desk are in the poem.
definitely. And then I took a translation class at Arizona, and Farid Matuk, who was my thesis advisor for the MFA, he gave us this assignment to transcribe a poem that was already in English, but then translate it into our English. So that involved a
Mm,
completely different set of, well, how exactly am I bringing someone's words, and not through paraphrase, but how am I and what am I doing to engage and to get into that mindset? So
mm,
the transcription, the translation, just and the different physicalities that come with a poem, even when you speak a poem out loud. Patrick Donnelly, great mentor, he would have us practice how to read our poems, and he had an exercise where we would say we'd have to shout, "The barn is on fire," to get the mouth gymnastics going on there. So more power to you, Patrick Donnelly, doing
yes.
great work as a mentor at the Frost Place. I believe they are doing their conference maybe in the coming days or so.
Oh.
You have a poem called Cold Lamp, and I'll read it in its entirety. It was the morning desire first distinguishes itself from, and then for the beloved. It was the season everybody paints houses blue for a blue home. If the light is yellow, paint green, which touched me like, is this the piano or the outside of the piano? Then this is the piano. Playing a chord. I trust most the prophets who hesitant ask, is that a prophet? Prophet's shadow, of a sparrow on the prophet's shadow of a branch. That's nest enough. Again, we've got that pragma logic, and it's found in those painting instructions. But what I especially love about this poem's ending are those monosyllables. That's nest, because they're surrounded by the soft and hard letter T. And then you take the word prophet, you have the plosive, also a word Patrick Donnelly taught me, the plosive P paired with that PH acting as an F. Then you have is this and is that. So those lines of questionings, there's that S softness, is, and then the rocky coastline of the letter T with that and hesitant. And then you have that K and ask. To what degree do you think about word texture when writing?
Hmm. It's everything. Texture, I think, is everything. It's texture and its companion repetition. To make sense is sensation. We're trying to make weather. And there's a texture that comes from that opening statement you read about painting, which again has that kind of false logic to it. A friend who's a painter read this early on and just wrote false next to that assertion about painting. But I think in terms of sound, I've spent a lot of time thinking about prosody in formal ways and in avant-garde ways to question what is contemporary prosody if language in English always has organizations of sound and texture, even if it's just visual, even if it's improvised or plain spoken, that's where we live. Um, I'm drawn to ideas of that you can correct me on. I might be coming at these things with whimsical pragmalogic. I'm drawn to ideas of the harmonic in poetry, in the sound or figure that emerges, that may not be the image that emerges, the feel that emerges, the sense of a rhythm that's distinct from just cadence. If cadence is in the line, it's what we could count off. There's also a rhythm that extends even after the line stops. And I think when we think of voice or tone or poets with distinct music, they're not just creating the cadence of a moment, they're creating a rhythm that achieves harmonic qualities that start to echo forward. So often in revision, what I'm doing is trying to put things together in the ways that you now just charted and took apart to follow that flow.
Well, prosody always, my musician self just leans in. Then I turn prosody into rhapsody, and you have the Rachmaninoff, that Rhapsody in a theme of Paganini, which has that virtuosity to it. I know there's that 18th variation that is played to death. It's the one, and everyone talks about that 18th variation where it's pure romanticism, but I'm more about the flashiness of that Rachmaninoff. But then you'll get Bartok. He's got two rhapsodies for violin and orchestra. I prefer the violin and piano versions because you can hear more of the violins. The combination of folk and virtuoso, and Bartok does that extremely well. And I just, when you think about prosody, you talked about the line, then that got me thinking about line span and wingspan. And for suddenly, I'm now in sort of Jory Grahamville, where you think about those long lines. And that in and of itself, that is a poetic wingspan right there, what she's doing with her, those lines that just will embrace that margin. And I guess in the prose forms that are all set in this book in Momently, I guess there is then that wingspan within the prose confines. And there is the flight component of it too. And it's like kind of like there's like a migration pattern going on too with the cover here. So
Absolutely. And I think that, it gets back to errors. This is material that I worked a lot, and I'm someone who's often thinking about rhythm in ways that can become regular. So to have the prose blocks, the margins are determined by the size of the page, creates breaks that counter the things I had done deliberately. And I liked that sense of randomness that would come in. Yeah.
yeah.
Into the wingspan, the breeze into the wings.
Mhm. Well, Momently, the final poem, it's Doan Brook, and it is the longest. So we're at that point in the interview now where, given the history of the interview series that all started with looking at the early versions and the published versions of poems, so we'll pay homage to the beginnings of our history with one week critique, and we'll take a look at Donebrook from the earliest inception. And I know this was more of the concepts you have with it in those first two screenshots we're going to look at, and then we'll talk about how it transformed or was transcribed into the version that it became. But if you could please read, and we'll get the magic of the shared screen here. Okay, I just have to. So here is the final version, and then we'll get to, if you could read this iteration of the way that some of the ideas took shape for Donebrook.
Sure. So I think I mentioned by email, I think this version's from 2018, um, but the a lot of the material that became this book goes back probably 2014, 2015, and it's material that I tried in many different configurations, and I could never get right, but I could also never quite let go. And
Mhm.
I wrote other books, published other books in the meantime, kept coming back to this family of language or concepts. So you'll see in these versions, I'm trying to put it together. Or to have been ruined for. Of course, the abyss has lichen, goats, beach cops where clovers lie like rail track flattened coins. The goats descend further before tasting of the lichen. I understand eternity. I'm small in the same way. As among the masterpieces one prefers anybody's sketching, have I loved it enough for it to be enough? I fold each book into petrified vines and their shards.
Nice. And then we have another screenshot where there's a little bit more of a, it's taken on more of a definitive structure.
Mhm. Yeah, so here you see I'm going back and forth between the caesura, the interrupted lines with the medial spaces, and statements that try to have what I called before a sense of solidity as an utterance.
Mhm.
So, to have been ruined for, in the immense gentling sense, I see no need to forgive me. I returned to earth for coffee. I had to do it and did it nevertheless. Of course, the abyss has lichens, goats, beach cops where clovers lie like rail track flattened coins. The goats descend further into the ravine before tasting of the lichens.
And what's interesting about this now, that fourth line, earth and coffee. So you've got the TH there, and that in coffee. And so the two F's and the two E's. And there's just something special, I think, about that texture of the and that and the E. If those will pick up on the audio version. And then I'm also having this thought that just came to mind about lichens, and I'm seeing a lot of lichens in poetry lately. And I think
Hmm.
this, I at Fairy Tale Review around 2022, 2023, we had a lot of mushroom and fungally themed poems, and definitely the year of mushrooms, 2023, the year of fungi. I think lichen, if I could make some sort of a poetry prediction, I think we'll see more lichen poems out there. And lichen may well be the new hummingbird of poetry.
It shows us where air quality is good. So yeah, it's gonna become an eco indicator of our time.
Good to hear. See lichen, write more lichen poems, everybody.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll get a lycra poem. Someone will have a little like a happy error where they misspell lichen and somehow they get lycra, and we'll get some lycra poems and
Yes, yes.
maybe some poems that's I don't I guess the only time I really think about lycra, there's some lines I think in the Steel Magnolias when Dolly Parton, someone's got a line about lycra. So maybe there'll be some Dolly, and there are some Dolly Parton poems out there too. But there is Donebrook, the finished version. Would you read that now for us? So we see how it all comes together?
Sure.
Okay, let me just get it shared here.
Doan Brook. Yet of course the abyss has lichens, goats, beach cops where clovers lie like rail track flattened coins. The goats descend further into the ravine before tasting of the lichens. Until then, I've put our name in for a table. A miracle would be all right. Nodded to the sidewalk person playing with broken glass. They put it in their pockets as I approached. I mean no harm, cutting their hands. Tipped the thin kid who comes from trees and is discreet and pumps your gas until the owner tells him to go. Stopped at the driveway lemonade stand. Driving away, I saw it, live lemon trees on the porch. On the way to the hospital, pushed a car. On the way to the hospital, carried a shelf, yawned, and guy on a ladder said, "Don't yawn, that shit's contagious, and I'm up a ladder up here." Don't see the idea, see around. In the last act, the loom becomes a boat, weaving its own sail for what flood, never better.
And it's interesting, you've got the never better at the ending, those nice little, the pitter patter of those I ams, and there's the like inconsistency that carried through and through. So how did those earlier years bring you to this iteration?
Hmm. I think it's a process of going back and forth between refining and rehydrating. So there's a sense that you saw in some of the earlier versions that this really overly compacted crystallization. That in this final version, I tried to disrupt by adding those more prosaic observations of the people encountered in a series of street moments, um, uh, and that's another example of clustering a type of image or a type of moment that in other books or other times of my life I would have spaced out, have one per poem, really develop it as an image or a theme. Here they're
They're
clustered
clustered.
together. Um, so I think that was key, the sense of how to make a refined surface and then rough it up with a richness of observation. I also thinking toward the end of this book, I wanted some conclusive phrases and feelings, this sense of never better, which you're right, it does it sonically. It puts a little stamp on there. It also carries, I hope, the feeling both of we will never be better. This is
Mhm.
chronic. This is ongoing. This is worsening. And nothing could be better. It's never been better. A
Mhm.
sense of brightness or lightness, both those qualities at once.
It's interesting with that hospital ladder because I often associate hospitals with, I mean, I had an MRI just for some eye just to see that it wasn't anything else, but that Adam El-Sergani, who was one of the founders of One Week Critique, when he was sort of preparing me for my MRI experience, he said something to the effect of, "Oh, it's just like being in Steve Reich's alarm clock." Or
Yes, yes.
so it's this, and I also, as that thing was pulsing through my head, I kept thinking about. I guess I use cinema as an escape to not have a little claustrophobia in the MRI machine because if you think about The Bride of Frankenstein, the 1935 movie during the creation scene, when the lightning is going and the sounds are just if you've not been in an MRI and you want to have the sound and Steve Reich may not be your composer, just play the creation scene of the bride in The Bride of Frankenstein and you'll have the exact aural duplicate of what it's like to be in an MRI.
Hmm.
So you've got those equipments that's cost the millions of dollars, and you have all sorts of automated parking, and but then you've got this ladder, just it could be this rickety ladder, it could be this wooden ladder. So it's such a low tech. And you also think about hospitals with mega elevators, right? Because you have to get from this floor to that floor to this wing to that wing, but yet we have this little accordion-like utilitarian device to help people
Mm-hmm.
climb to maybe change the light bulb or to kind of push the little loose wires back in the ceiling.
Mm. Mm. No, I love that, and I think of I've been fascinated by the rhythms in MRI machines. It might be a sickness, but you're right. Things happen in there, and I love that sense of the high tech up against the ladder. Absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah, watch more Frankenstein movies, everybody. Yes. Well, you also have a poem called Good Humor, and this describes, speaking of technology, how advances in music technology have done nothing for ice cream truck music technology. It is best jangly, cloying, unchanged. This takes me back to the viola grad school program at Cleveland Institute of Music because I played on Amitai Varde's graduate recital, Brahms B minor clarinet quintet. This would have been April of 2001. if the memory's still intact. And it's got that fourth movement, which is it has a B major section. And our second violinist, Jacqueline Sayed-Wilborski, hi Jackie, if you're watching, she said it sounded like the ice cream truck. And going off of that ice cream truck memory, the next section of Good Humor, it claims that rusted water towers hold the purest water. Now I tie that into Brahms because there's a purity of B major. We're talking five sharps here. And when you pit that amid B minordom, which is just, the two sharps, the F sharp and the C sharp. So that luxury of having now five sharps to your palette as a musician, and especially the leading tone would be an A sharp to that B. And that's A sharp is a pretty beautiful because, if you were to look at its mirror image, it'd be the B flat, which is not all that fun of a note, but A sharp, there's something special about that. And another composer that I always think about with purity, it's Ernest Chausson. He's mostly known for this composition, Poem for Violin and Orchestra, but he has a piece of chamber music. It's a concerto for violin, piano, and string quartet. And speaking of rust, there is that decidedly oxidized beginning. The piano notes have a D, A, E, and that interval wise, we go up a fifth, then down a fourth. And that's also reiterated by the string quartet. And finally, you have the soloist that's also doing the D, A, E. It's a re-raveling. That is purity as opposed to unraveling. Now, how does your daily proximity to visual artists and musicians, you're in that university circle cluster with Cleveland Institute of Art, so you could probably on your lunch hour maybe go walk to the Cleveland Institute of Music. If they still have the little mini cafeteria down there, you could probably pop some of the popcorn in the mic. I don't know what a 25-year-old microwave is, if it's still good, but I just remember when I was a musician at Cleveland Institute of Music, sometimes going to the Cleveland Institute of Art and popping microwave in their student lounge popcorn microwave maker. But you're in such a wealth of proximity of all this amazing culture. You've got also Severance Hall, which is Cleveland Orchestra's home. How does being immersed with music and art at the level of students who are getting serious in terms of their degree and their study and preparing for orchestra auditions and learning what it's like to be an artist in this regard and an artist in this regard, how does that add to your poetry? And also, I guess, with the sculpting aspect too. With
Oh yeah, yeah. No, just incredibly fortunate to get to spend my days at the Cleveland Institute of Art and in University Circle for all the reasons you mentioned. I, poets. I think I came to poetry because it seemed like a way to stay interested in a lot of things, and I've been very fortunate that the teaching I do now gets to be capacious in that way. Sometimes I teach poetry class. More often, I'm teaching literature, writing in different forms, courses with community connections. Poetry offers a model for a mode of inquiry, a way of thinking, a way of engaging that is propelled in an art setting. Student artists are used to thinking about experiment. They're used to working really hard. They're used to working with materials to get at questions that go beyond what we can say. Uh, Poetry uses language like that kind of material. We try out the thing and then we think about it. So I find that it feeds my own sense, not just of the poetic, but of the affirming qualities of the arts in general. To be at a place where you aren't always fighting for the first rhetorical inch to say that the arts exist or creativity
mm,
matters. You're with people who are already holding the net out for each other. The work that students do is incredible. It's adventurous. It leaps. It finds its way to new forms. It gives a charge that we need to keep doing the same. So
mhm.
yeah, it was just a really, really fortunate place to be. I haven't found that microwave yet, but I'll try to imagine the oral technology, the music technology of the microwave that's 25 years old. What's its ding that still like flavors the popcorn?
Right. Oh, and microwave popcorn, it is so up there on the health and nutrition. I mean, and that the lichen
Yes.
probably smells that, and the lichen is probably even repelled by the microwave popcorn. So But I do miss those days of just having, because I would have, I think we talked a little bit before the interview started about how my string quartet, it was a Haydn quartet, and we would, all musicians, if you're serious about your quartet, you go and you make sure you have all the same corresponding measure numbers. So you block out maybe one day where you're just going and sitting down and you're numbering the measures in your score and in your part so that if you say, okay, well, let's go back to measure 36 so that we can get this downbeat and the syncopations in measure 77 through 84, we've got to maybe have a little more
Mm.
tightness with that. And if it's taking you the better half of the rehearsal just to find, I mean, I know some scores will have now letter A, letter B, letter C, but there's something bonding about just sitting with four people or three other people and then just, okay, is this line number one for you two? And how about number 10? And we would measure our numbers or number our measures in the Cleveland Institute of Art in the lobby. And we're in the
Oh,
student area. And there's a microwave there. I remember the Cleveland Institute of Music, Aquafina. That was, and people said it made a little like the way that it opened, the air pressure of, I guess, of an Aquafina in 2000 was different from the way if you opened up like a Dasani. So, and leave it to musicians to calibrate the way that bottled water has different tonal harmonic qualities. But
mm.
sure enough, they figured it out. So I always think about that with Aquafina now. It's 2000 and here it is opening and we get this little bit of a pitch release.
Oh, beautiful.
So you have the first section of the poem permanently that says, "One day I'll open this window. From the outside, I'll see a spider on pewter, thistles and brick. In the washing machine, think how different it was 5 years ago. It's that different whenever you want." This is especially resonant because it reminds me of my second year living in Cleveland. At the height of my OCD, I'm in Twin Gables apartment complex on good old East 115th Street. I'm living in this second floor efficiency unit. I'm barely attending class, barely making it out of the square footage. My kitchen had a glass door cabinet and actually put some little G.I. Joe action figures, Scarlet, Flash, CoverGirl, Tripwire, and Ripcord. And I bought them at Big Fun, that store that used to be on Coventry Avenue. It's a haven for 70s and 80s toy nostalgia. And those figures, they would remind me, even at the worst of mental illness, just there was this period of 1983 and 1984, and it was presto, kitchen table time travel. And there are time-rich phrases throughout Momently, and even the title is time-rich. But some examples of those phrases are not even noon in the janky bird bath, your age in snow years. Perhaps try this same piece of the puzzle in the same gap next month. What might date books and calendars teach us about poetry that instructor mentors cannot?
I love this question so much. I mean, one of the best poetry exercises I was ever given by an instructor mentor at the University of Washington, one of my first and most abiding instructor mentors, the poet Richard Kenny, he'd have us keep a notebook of daily observations, the things that you see on a walk that knock you off autopilot, that flash through bright, that make you like the wooden bricks in the alley, that make you want to say, look at that.
Mhm.
Those records are often more interesting than the poems you try to write when you try to write your deepest poems. You know, just the journals, the day books, the
Mhm.
notebooks. I love reading other writers and artists, not just diaries where they're thinking about something or telling a story, but really like notebooks, annotations.
Mhm.
Um, what do those show us? They show us um, time coming through in moments in which we get a landscape that accrues not through our trying to construct it, to force it into a diorama, but in the action figures in the cupboard. Each of those, you know, that's different than putting them in a landscape that if you were painting a picture where you were locating them in an action scene, you know,
Mhm.
so you get a sense of the pointed particular, but with also the a naturally accruing backdrop, you know, something about the setting that it's in. So, yeah, I think you know, the word momently, often titles of collections are a kind of tuning fork for me that then gives a sense of how things should ricochet. That word came to me first from the poet Nikki Neames, who also runs the great stationery and gift store RSVP in Iowa City. She used it in a poem, and I was just floored by it. The sense of momently has the momentous, it has the monumental, it has the momentarily. It's a word that feels to me both very clear, but also a little hard to say. Momently, it kind of falls off. Um, so yeah, I all about time.
Yes. And the Antly too. I had the really awesome opportunity to talk with my mentor Jane Miller from University of Arizona. And I guess this is maybe a preview since she's our going to be our 70th interview, but
Mm.
we have a moment where we talk about gentleness in her book Paper Banners, but then there's a line, I think the salt air gently, so that the Antly, which ties in with momently. But then I
Hmm.
guess at the other extreme, you have a car, you have a Bentley, which is this pristine, top of the line automobile, which way, way, way out of the price range. But I'm always fascinated by the end, like gentleman moment or momentarily, and then what you can do with an ly. I mean, adverbs they get their bad rap, but every now and then they will make you redefine your relationship to what you want to do with the letter L and Y in a poem.
Hmm.
So that's what we have with momently. And you also have a poem that is called Saginaw. And if you're not from Michigan, it is a city in Michigan. And the poem features the object logic line. So not the pragma logic, but this object logic of build the guitar around the humming string. And the piano was too large to discard, so you learned it. In the book's acknowledgments, you thank friends of Theodore Retke in Saginaw, Michigan. Retke, that's a later discovery for me, but where would my syllabi be without Redkey's cuttings, the waking, and my papa's waltz? Who are some mid 20th century poets you'd like to see reaching greater student and reader audiences?
Mm. Well, we can start with Retke. That works. I encourage everyone to make your way to Saginaw, and you can see his childhood home, maintained by the Friends of Theodore Retke, which is really just a model for an organization that is promoting legacy, but in a big way. So it's not just about the poet; it's about everything that his work has meant and can mean for that community. So, for example, they do a lot with education. They do a lot around advocacy in relation to mental health, around things that he experienced that might not have been expressed in their time in the ways they are now. The piano line, that's true. When they trucked away all the stuff from the house to the archives at the University of Washington in Seattle, the piano was too large to move. The piano that, my Papa's waltz is still dancing on. Um, so, someone I first encountered in Seattle, a poet of the Pacific Northwest and of Michigan, two places also in my life. And if I think of I think of mid-century poets in general. One reason I might start with him is that I just published a book that's all about the complicated legacy in my own life of Retke's work. I still need to send you a copy. It's by the
Okay.
door, waiting for the post
Oh,
office,
thanks.
where things remain, sometimes for months. Um, and what I like about his work, as
Right,
with others of that
right
era,
here on the chair. Some things need to be sent out.
sometimes they need to wait for a while and accrue something else from the environment. Um,
Some
I love
lichen.
some lichen, yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing I talk about in the book, you see when I return to poets from the mid-century, I see commonalities that defy the narratives I was taught about poetic school. So, for example, when I look at Retke's work now, I see echoes to someone like Robert Duncan, someone who was really not associated with what Retke was up to at the time, especially when I look at things like notebooks, back to diaries, annotations, letters. I see things come through that have just such a sense of exploration. So, in terms of people that students should read, I think starting with the contemporary, why not? There's so much happening right now in poetry. We've mentioned half a dozen people already. Jane Miller, you could do a lot worse than starting by reading a whole bunch of Jane Miller. And
Mhm.
then I think just reading as widely as possible and finding all the ways to, activate the different zones of feeling. Um, I'm trying to think, do you have people that you're recommending a lot? I haven't taught that kind of like survey of the 20th century in a while, so I might be a little rusty with coming to things. Who are some of the top folks on your list now?
Well, when I teach poetry in a literary interpretation class, I group it around different theoretical frameworks. So if I have a queer theory unit, I'll have some Eduardo C. Corral, I'll have some Torrin Greathouse in there. I will have some Carol Ann Duffy. And then if I'm trying to do, for example, early on a unit on disability theory, then I will have poets who are writing in terms of disability, and that would look something along the lines. There's also an Abecedarian by Torrin Greathouse. Also for queer theory, there would be Richie Hoffman. I believe it's called Book of Statues. It was, I think, published in Poetry Magazine maybe a couple of years prior, but it alludes to, I believe, the 1998 murder of Matthew Shepard. And then you have to have that conversation with your students who were probably born in between maybe 2006, 2008. So this is something that they would have never heard of unless they're very much attuned to queer politics. Actually, since we have the luxury of time, I'm going to get up my syllabus
Oh,
since this
hey.
is just this is an educational series, and why not just spread the opportunities of what we think of. So when you teach poets, do you lump them together by theoretical frameworks?
Last time I used to teach a poetry and poetics class that really focused on a very similar approach to what you're describing. Often that would start in the 1950s and then look
Mhm.
at, postmodern avant-gardes as in response to one another. So we'd look at Black Mountain poets, we'd look at, and we'd follow an idea of projective verse over to San Francisco, and then we'd come into the present. Um, Often reading some contemporary collections in entirety along the way and asking how we might see echoes with
Mm.
some of the theories and historical formulations that we've been looking at. That was always really fun to do, and sometimes we then work backward, knowing that we don't actually experience literature chronologically in our own life. We don't start reading the anthology on page one and move back, so then, sometimes we then dip back into ask, how can we see leaves of grass,
Mm.
in light of everything we've looked at?
Right. So I found my list. So if I'm doing, for example, a disability themed framework, Stutter, it's by Adam
Oh,
Gianelli,
yeah.
and also Prayer to My Stutter and Prayers to My Stutter, series 1 and 3 by the poet Jerome Ellis, who they spell their name with multiple J's to represent the stutter that they have.
Mm.
Symptoms by Laurie Clements Lambeth, who is a poet writing about multiple sclerosis. Adam Wolfund is a non-speaking autistic poet, The Beauty of Autistic Knowing. A poet that my students love, Jubilee Finnegan. I discovered their work on the Word Gathering Journal website, Liminality of Therapy Waiting Rooms. And I teach some poems by the cyborg Jillian Wise, so non-disabled demands, I Want Your Facts, and also a biohack manifesto. So, and we just link them around, well, how is this building greater empathy if you do not have a disability? How is this
Hmm.
helping you get into a larger world than what you are currently experiencing? And let's see, if we just jump into another unit, if I'm teaching, say, my ego criticism packet, I have Miko Harvey, Camille Dungy, Matthew Olsman, Letter to Someone Living 50 Years from Now. I have some Gary Soto's got a poem, Earth Day by the Bay or on the Bay. Maya C. Popa has a poem that's like a letter to Noah's wife, which talks about just what we're doing on this planet right now to mess it up ecologically. And in the post-colonial packet, and I'm probably getting the traditional Zoom reflection off of these glasses, but again, it's for educational means, so it's all good. I will take the Zoom reflection. Calibel Alegria, Flowers from the Volcano. Kamal Braithwaite has a poem called Bread. Kevin Gilbert, it's a very short poem called Shame. He's an Aboriginal Australian. Kofi Awanur has this metaphorical, rich, shorter poem called The Weaver Bird. And also Ma'e, who's a Burmese poet, and Aung Chaimt, also a Burmese poet. So I look for ways that we can get a better understanding of these theories because in the literary interpretation courses at Western Michigan University, we want you to do incorporation of literary theory in your research papers. So if it means that a student is writing a quasi book review on the cyborg Gillian Wise, they are touching on certain poems and also bringing in disability theory because there's the medical model of disability theory and the social model. So they're commenting on how does Wise maybe encompass one model more than the other, and how is there may be some eschewing of the medical model.
Hmm.
And I taught actually a literature psychology course this semester or last semester at Western Michigan University, and we had units around addiction. So I would bring in Kava Akbar. We had a. I also brought in some Era D. Matthews from Simulacra, the Narcissus Tweets poems, which is interesting because Twitter, not so much these days, but back when Twitter was of sort of a more, I guess you could have more poetic conversations on there. The way that she had that the restraint of so many characters and having these mythological beings tweet.
Hmm.
And interestingly enough, I brought in Anne Sexton, the double image, and I think the rhyming didn't really go fly so well with the students. And I think I was the most crestfallen when I brought in Heart's Needle, because I'm going to go on record, thank you, One Week Critique, to say that I think it's the first poem written about co-parenting from a man's perspective. And this is late 1950s. And I read that as I was preparing for my comprehensive exams in fall of 2019, and it just has stayed with me ever since. But none of my students wrote about it during the exam. I think maybe the rhyming or maybe the sequential nature of it just wasn't for them. And there's also a larger prose poem by Era D. Matthews from her book Bread and Circus. It's called The Cost of the Floss, which is about she is basically doing a flex to buy something that's well without of her price range, but just to prove that she can to these sort of racially profiling owners of a vintage store. So she ends up buying a hazmat suit for $500, and the whole prose poem explores what it's like to then to try to prove that you can afford this vintage hazmat suit. Which I mean, who doesn't want to go buy a vintage hazmat suit and just to prove that you can? But she also will talk about the various ways some of these tchotchkes are situated in the store. She'll start off the poem talking about her childhood and growing up without many means, and how just she wouldn't bring friends back to the house so they wouldn't see it. So we discussed that, and I found that I'm basically kind of juggling poetry and drama and fiction and starting to bring in more essays.
Hmm.
But it's always, I mean, and when I'm doing an intro to poetry workshop, it's what I did at USM was we had Dean Young, The Art of Recklessness, love that book. And I actually talked about that with Jane Miller on the next podcast. And I taught all of Anne Sexton's Transformations because I've got the fairy tale background for that with Fairy Tale Review. I brought in Gary Soto's The Elements of San Joaquin because part of my PhD focuses on Latinx literature. And what's I think fundamental about that book, and most people know him for Oranges, that poem, but what I love about The Elements of San Joaquin is it's a collection from 1977, which is also the year that I'm born. So it's kind of like a nice little, okay, here John starts out in the world, and here's this book. And I like to say that it's sort of the herald of Latinx literature that carries us into the 80s and through the 90s. And maybe it's so he's sort of starting us. And if we think mid 90s, you've got Martina Zapata, Imagine the Angels of Bread. I think that was a 1997 collection. And from that, then you also would then build up to around the time Slow Lightning comes out in maybe 2011.
Hmm.
But if you also back up to your earlier 80s poems, you would have Lorna de Cervantes, from the Implumata 1981 collection. So Cannery Town in August is one that I teach. And in my American Lit course that's just wrapping up, we did some Retke, we did some Yusuf Komunyakaa, we did especially Facing It, and then we did some Lucille Clifton poems and some Lee Young Lee, the Persimmons poem. And it's just what what I think students need as far as much diversity of voices for them.
Mhm.
If as long as if you are in my class, I want you to see some aspect of your life reflected on the syllabus, for you to have that mirroring, for you to have that touch point, that touchstone, and for other students then to be able to experience that. And it's, I guess now I'm thinking about my intro class in the fall. So I'm again poems that will, I'm calling it repertoire. I've decided to do away with that word canon, and it's just if the musician in me, we're going to straight up into the repertoireville. So I
Mhm.
think the very first day, Georgia Line, where I'm from, always great to have that as a prompt, because you can have students then write. That poem talks about geographically where she's from, but also family based. So students can start to build community, and everyone will get the same where I'm from assignment to write, so that we all come in, and the second day of class, everyone will read their where I'm from poem. And I do love, it's this poem, Orientation, I think Wittenberg University, fall 1983 by A. Van Jordan, which it's in a form where the end lines, not quite as Sestina, but you'd have that the lines are sort of folding in on each other. The end words are more compressed and they work out from each other. But it's about his experience as a student of color, as a first generation, I believe, college student at this very white liberal arts college. And there's this moment where he wants to leave, and his mom's saying, you know, if you kind of like, if you want to, if this isn't for you, then this isn't for you. We can get out of here. But he's just making that decision. No, sometimes you need to be in these situations. And I have many students that see themselves in that poem. So just a lot of opportunities to show them through poetry what is possible, and how, if no one has ever spoken about your, if you've never read about it or seen yourself on a syllabus, it's my goal that you at least start to get some of those larger possibility doors open through making some of those connections. And if it's, whether it's through a disability theory unit or a queer theory unit that's
Mhm.
incorporated, or a post-colonial theory unit where we have some Sophia Sinclair on there, or Lauren K. Aline, she's a Trinidadian poet who I've discovered through Fairy Tale Review. And she actually had a poem in our last issue called La Diabolise Gretel, and La Diabolise is a Trinidadian folklore figure. So it all goes back to,
Hmm.
I guess for me, having that fairy tale wealth to draw on, but also just the ways that I want students to have that, you see yourself here, you see yourself there, and this is what our writing community consists of. This is a
Mhm.
long answer, but it was so well worth
Oh,
it. We did
wonderful.
all the little labyrinths, and even if it means that at the very beginning of the answer that I just have a little bit of a blank, you know, but it was worth it.
Yes, absolutely.
All in the name of poetry. Well, thank you again for your time and for your generosity of knowledge, Zach. Are there any poems? We have time if you'd like to read two from Momently as we bring our podcast to a close, or if not from Momently, any other poems you'd like to read?
Oh, sure. I'll just read, open at random and see where we are. Um, this is the poem called Chandelier. Um, what message could you see on the path to make you stop or hurry past and return? The problem with most things is they're already something else. I count slower to give everyone longer to hide. There's what no one wants to hear and what no one hears. Rowers pull alongside the river. Could we turn events back into instances? All the versions of this song are live. Scant rosemary, barely enough for one bee. I knew he'd pretend he knew any poet I mentioned, so I mentioned my friend.
Nice.
Nice place to end after
It
hearing the
is.
syllabus full of all the different poets.
Yes.
Yeah, John, thank you so much for your time and the great conversation. So many good zinging directions.
You're welcome. And chandelier, I mean, that there's technology, there's beauty with that. I mean, I don't know many hospital chandeliers, but You could, I guess, but you would have to get on a ladder to hang at the hospital. Probably at the hospital
Absolutely.
ballroom. Probably the Cleveland Clinic probably has like a gala ballroom where you just go for the the donors. They probably are some chandeliers at Cleveland Clinic, I would imagine.
I'm sure there's a grand lobby with a Chihuly chandelier kind of thing somewhere.
And you need the ladders for the chandeliers. So, where else might we find? So you have these collections and you have the Retke book. Are there any other podcasts or online readings that are coming up where we can find more of your work?
I'm not sure what's coming up most recently. But the new book, the book that features Retke prominently is called A Field of Telephones. It's out from the terrific publisher 53rd State Press. They focus on published versions of experimental theater and works for performance. So really wonderful to have it featured among just a terrific list there.
Nice. Well, thank you again. Momently is a book that I'm going to have some more interesting conversations with when I talk to friends about it. And I'm going in for rereads so that I can just say that I now have this sort of just, I guess my reading experience will be like the cover. It's just kind of, there's no end to it. It's the Ouroboros of exquisite poetry.
And again, just the celebration of the publishers who understand how to show that through design. So just
Yeah.
a real gift. Yeah, John, thank you. Your questions and your reading are so appreciated.
Oh, well, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure, Zach. Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.